I was standing in my grandfather's hallway with a check for $28 million folded in my jacket pocket, close enough to hear my own family plotting to steal it from me. My father's voice was flat, businesslike, the same tone he used when closing a deal. My mother actually laughed at the idea of convincing everyone I wasn't mentally fit to manage my own inheritance. My brother added his own insult, something about a soldier not knowing the first thing about money. I stood frozen behind that door, my hand still raised to knock, and something inside me went very quiet and very cold. 3 days earlier, I had been halfway across the world, finishing the last stretch of a deployment that had already taken 11 months of my life. The message came through military channels, terse and official. My grandfather, William Foster, had passed away. I remember staring at the screen in the operations tent, feeling the ground tilt slightly beneath me, though nothing around me had actually moved. William Foster was the only person in my family who had ever looked at me and seen someone worth being proud of. Growing up, I had never fit the mold my parents wanted. My brother went straight into the family business after college, comfortable in tailored suits and boardrooms, exactly the kind of son my father could brag about at country club dinners. I chose the army instead. I remember the dinner where I announced it, the silence that followed my mother setting down her fork, like I'd said something obscene. My father asked me without raising his voice why I would throw away every advantage I'd been given to go play soldier. I didn't have a clean answer then. I just knew I needed something real, something that couldn't be bought or inherited, something I would have to earn with my own hands and my own discipline. My grandfather was the only one who understood. He never said much about it in front of the family, that wasn't his way, but he would call me on holidays when no one else did ask real questions about my life, instead of performing concern for an audience. He sent me letters overseas, actual paper letters, filled with small observations about the garden or the weather, or some memory from his own time in the service decades earlier. He never told me he was proud. He didn't have to. I felt it in every line he wrote. The funeral was held on a gray Tuesday that matched exactly how I felt inside. I flew in on emergency leave, still carrying the tightness in my shoulders that never quite leaves you after months in a combat zone, and I stood at the graveside in my dress uniform because it was the only formal clothing I owned that still fit right. My father gave a eulogy about legacy and hard work, the kind of speech that sounded rehearsed for effect rather than felt. My brother stood beside him, nodding along. I said nothing. I watched the casket lower into the ground, and I thought about the man who used to sit with me on his porch, teaching me to identify birds by their calls, telling me that real strength was quiet and didn't need an audience. After the service, as people drifted toward their cars in dark suits and somber conversation, a man in a gray overcoat approached me. He introduced himself as Robert Hale, my grandfather's attorney, and pressed a sealed envelope into my hand. He told me in a low voice meant only for me not to open it until I was home alone with the door locked. There was something in his eyes, not sadness, exactly more like a warning, that made my stomach tighten before I even understood why. I waited until I was back in my rental car engine, running heater humming against the cold, before I broke the seal. Inside were legal documents I barely had time to skim, and a single handwritten letter in my grandfather's careful, old-fashioned script. I was the sole beneficiary of a trust fund valued at $28 million. Not split among the family, not divided by some formula of fairness, mine entirely. His letter explained what the documents couldn't. He wrote that he loved my parents and my brother, but that he had watched for years how they treated ambition as currency and family as leverage. He wrote that he trusted me because I had never once asked him for anything, because I had built a life out of discipline instead of entitlement. He asked me to be careful. He said the family wouldn't understand, and that I should only reveal the truth when I was ready to stand firm in it. I sat in that car for a long time, engine idling, watching my breath fog against the windshield, feeling the weight of his trust settle onto my shoulders like a second uniform. I decided right there that I wouldn't hide from this. I would go to the house that evening and tell my parents and my brother the truth myself on my own terms, with honesty instead of secrecy. That decision was still fresh in my mind when I walked up the porch steps of my parents' house that night, envelope tucked inside my jacket, ready to speak. It was the sound of voices through the half-closed study door that stopped me cold. My father's calm, calculating tone. My mother's soft laughter. My brother's careless insult about soldiers and money. I stood there in the hallway, one hand still raised toward the door, and I understood with sudden clarity that the people I had been about to trust with the truth had already decided how to destroy me for it. I lowered my hand slowly. I did not knock. I turned and walked back out into the cold night air, and somewhere behind that door my family kept talking, completely unaware that I already knew everything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the guest room of the house I grew up in, the same house where I'd just learned exactly what my family thought of me, and I read through every page of the trust documents until the words started to blur. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I stopped feeling angry and started feeling something steadier, colder, more useful. If they wanted to play a quiet game, I could play it better than any of them. The next morning I called Robert Hale from the parking lot of a coffee shop 2 towns over, far enough that no one would recognize my car. He picked up on the second ring like he'd been expecting me. I told him I'd read everything, and he asked carefully if I had any questions. I had dozens. He answered them one by one, patient in a way that reminded me of my grandfather's own steadiness. The trust wasn't simple cash sitting in an account. It was a sprawling structure, shares in 3 companies my grandfather had quietly invested in decades earlier. 2 commercial properties in the city, a portfolio of long-term investments that Robert said had been growing untouched for almost 20 years. He explained that my grandfather had built most of this fortune privately, apart from the family business specifically, so no one else would have a claim to it. And then he told me the part that made me sit up straighter in my seat. I wasn't just the beneficiary. My grandfather had named me sole trustee with complete authority to manage, protect, or distribute the assets as I saw fit. There was a condition attached, one Robert read to me slowly so I wouldn't miss its weight. If I was ever coerced into signing away my rights, or if anyone successfully proved I was mentally or legally unfit to manage the trust, the entire fortune would bypass my family completely and transfer to a veterans charity my grandfather had supported for years. He'd built a wall around me that even he couldn't have known I'd need so quickly. I asked Robert quietly if he thought my grandfather had known this was coming. There was a pause on the line before he answered. He told me my grandfather had suspected for a long time that certain members of the family were trying to influence his decisions. Robert admitted almost reluctantly that my grandfather had recorded several private conversations in his final years, conversations he never fully explained the purpose of, only that they should be kept safe with the rest of his documents. Sitting in that parking lot, coffee going cold in the cup holder, I finally understood. My grandfather hadn't just loved me quietly from a distance. He had been watching, listening, building a case in the shadows, because he knew exactly what kind of people he was dealing with. He'd protected me before I even knew I needed protecting. I drove back to my parents' house that afternoon because avoiding them would have raised more suspicion than facing them. My mother met me at the door with an embrace that felt performative, her hand patting my back twice like she was checking a box. She told me the family needed to stick together during this difficult time. My father, appearing behind her, added that we should all have dinner together that night as a family to properly grieve. I watched my brother lean against the doorframe, arms crossed, saying nothing, his eyes flicking toward me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Calculation, maybe, or guilt trying to disguise itself as concern. I said yes to dinner. I smiled when it was expected of me. I let my mother squeeze my hand across the table and murmur about how proud my grandfather would be of our closeness. Every word out of her mouth felt like a performance staged for an audience that didn't exist, and I understood watching her that she believed I still had no idea what waited beneath the surface of that affection. Dinner stretched long, filled with careful conversation that circled the subject of the will without ever landing on it directly. My father mentioned almost casually that the reading of the will would happen soon, that everyone should be prepared for whatever Grandpa decided. I caught the slight tightening around his eyes when he said it, the tell of a man trying too hard to sound unconcerned. My brother asked me with false lightness whether the army had taught me anything about handling money, since apparently that was a running joke to him now. I told him honestly that discipline was discipline whether you were managing a platoon or a portfolio. He laughed like I'd made a joke. I hadn't. Later that night, back in the guest room, I opened my laptop and began reading everything Robert had sent over: statements, property deeds, the full itemized structure of the trust. I found myself lingering on a photo included in one folder, an old picture of my grandfather standing beside the first property he'd purchased decades before any of us were born. His smile wide and unguarded in a way I rarely saw as an adult. He built all of this alone, patiently, and chose in the end to hand it to the one person in the family who had never asked him for anything. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long while, listening to the quiet house around me. My parents' bedroom door closed at the end of the hall. My brother's old room now converted into an office he barely used. Somewhere in this house they were already planning how to take what wasn't theirs. And somewhere inside me a decision was hardening into something unshakable. I would give them every chance to show me who they really were. And I would be ready when they did. The invitation came 4 days later, delivered the way everything in my family arrived through my mother's carefully worded text message, all warmth on the surface. She wrote that it was time for a family meeting, just the 4 of us, to talk through next steps, now that the will was moving forward. She added a heart emoji at the end, as if that would soften whatever was coming. I read the message twice. Sitting in my car outside the hardware store where I'd been picking up supplies to fix a loose hinge on Grandpa's old porch door, and I felt the same cold clarity I'd had the night I stood outside that study. I arrived at my parents' house that Saturday afternoon in civilian clothes, deliberately unremarkable, wanting to give away nothing. My mother greeted me at the door with coffee already poured, my favorite mug pulled from the back of the cabinet, a small gesture clearly meant to signal how much she cared. My father was seated in the living room beside a man I didn't recognize, gray-haired, wearing a suit that looked more expensive than anything my father owned. He was introduced as Gerald Whitfield, a longtime financial advisor and family friend there, simply to help make sure everything was handled fairly. I sat down across from them, coffee cooling in my hands, and I understood within the first 60 seconds that this wasn't a family meeting. It was an ambush, dressed up in hospitality. Gerald opened a leather folder and slid a stack of papers across the coffee table toward me, explaining in a smooth, practiced voice that these documents were simply standard procedure, a formality to ensure the estate was distributed fairly among all the children and grandchildren. He said it the way a man says something he said 100 times before, confident no one in the room would actually read past the first page. My father nodded along beside him, arms crossed, watching my face for a reaction. I picked up the papers, slowly scanning the dense legal language, and felt my pulse steady into something almost meditative, the way it used to during high-stakes moments overseas. Buried in paragraph 4, dressed in polite legal phrasing, was language that would strip me of my role as trustee and redistribute control of the trust to a family committee. A committee that unsurprisingly consisted of my father, my brother, and Gerald himself. I looked up and asked as innocently as I could manage what exactly this document was for. My brother, sitting in the armchair by the window, let out a short laugh and said something about how I probably wouldn't understand it anyway, that I'd spent the last decade learning how to hold a rifle, not how to read a contract. My mother added gently that it might just be easier for someone with more financial experience to handle things, so I wouldn't have to worry about all this stress on top of grieving. I set the papers down on the table, deliberately unsigned, and told them I needed more time to review everything properly before making any decisions. The room's temperature seemed to drop instantly. My father leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone I remembered from childhood arguments, the one that meant patience was running out. He said there really wasn't much to review, that this was simply what Grandpa would have wanted. Fairness for everyone, rather than one person hoarding an entire fortune. I almost laughed at that. Fairness, as if I hadn't heard them planning in their own voices to make the world believe I was incompetent. I kept my expression neutral, the same blank calm I'd perfected during briefings where showing weakness wasn't an option, and I told them I simply wasn't comfortable signing anything without my own legal counsel reviewing it first. Gerald's smile faltered slightly just for a second before he recovered it. My brother shifted in his chair, glancing toward our father like he was waiting for direction. My mother's hand found my forearm, her grip a fraction too tight to be purely comforting, and she said in a voice pitched for sympathy that She just didn't want to see me make a mistake I couldn't undo, that grief could cloud anyone's judgment. I looked at her hand on my arm and then at her face, searching for any trace of the woman who used to bandage my scraped knees, and found only calculation staring back. I told her calmly that my judgment was fine, that 11 months overseas hadn't dulled my ability to read a contract or recognize when I was being pressured. The silence that followed was heavier than anything spoken in that room. My father stood abruptly, saying we could revisit this conversation once I'd had time to calm down, his tone making it clear he believed my refusal was emotional rather than deliberate. I stood as well, thanked Gerald for his time with a politeness that cost me nothing, and walked toward the door without another word. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice drop low, murmuring something to my father I couldn't quite catch, followed by my brother's frustrated exhale. I drove away from that house with my hands steady on the wheel, replaying every detail of the meeting, cataloging it the way I'd been trained to catalog any hostile encounter. They had shown their hand faster than I expected. They believed they could bury a soldier under paperwork, and sympathy that grief and unfamiliarity would make me pliable. What they didn't understand was that patience wasn't a weakness I'd developed by accident. It was a skill I had built through years of discipline, and now it was the only weapon I needed. I wasn't planning to fight them in that living room. I was planning to let them keep underestimating me until the moment it cost them everything. I called Robert Hale the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee, my voice tighter than I intended when I told him what happened in that living room. He listened without interrupting the way he always did. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before asking if I could come to his office that afternoon. There was something in the careful way he said it, like he'd been waiting for this exact conversation, that told me he had more to show me than what was in the paperwork. His office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind of place with creaking wood floors and file cabinets that looked older than I was. Robert met me at the door himself, no receptionist buffering the visit, and led me back to a private room with the blinds drawn. He sat across from me, folded his hands on the desk, and told me that before we went any further, there was something my grandfather had specifically instructed him to show me if the family ever tried what they'd just attempted. He turned his laptop toward me and pressed play on a video file. My grandfather's face filled the screen, seated in his study, the same room where I used to do homework as a kid while he read the newspaper across from me. He looked tired in the recording, older than I remembered him looking in person, but his eyes were sharp, focused directly on the camera, like he knew exactly who would eventually be watching. He explained in a steady voice that this recording was being made because he no longer trusted certain members of his family to act in good faith. He described calmly and without theatrics how my father and brother had approached him on separate occasions over the past 2 years, pressuring him to rewrite his will, to remove provisions that gave me any independent stake in the estate. He said they framed it as concern for his well-being, insisting an old man shouldn't be managing such complicated finances alone, but the underlying message was always the same. They wanted control, and I was standing in the way of it. I sat frozen in that chair, watching my grandfather's face, listening to him describe conversations I'd never known about, moments where my own family had tried to manipulate a grieving, aging man for financial gain. Robert paused the video for a moment and told me quietly that it got worse. He clicked forward to a second recording, this one shorter, my grandfather visibly more shaken. In it, he described an incident where my father had suggested, not entirely as a joke, that perhaps it was time to consider additional support for Grandpa, the kind of phrase people use right before mentioning assisted living facilities. My grandfather said he understood exactly what that threat meant: sign over more control or risk being deemed unfit to live independently. My hands had curled into fists in my lap without my noticing. I asked Robert, my voice lower than I intended, why my grandfather never told me any of this while he was alive. Robert explained that my grandfather hadn't wanted to burden me while I was deployed, hadn't wanted me carrying that weight alongside everything else I was already managing overseas. He said my grandfather refused every attempt to change the will, held his ground through months of pressure, and instead spent that time quietly building an ironclad case in case things ever escalated after his death. Robert reached into a drawer and pulled out a sealed letter explaining that my grandfather had prepared it specifically to be read aloud, if the family ever pursued formal legal action to challenge the trust. He hadn't wanted me to open it unless it became necessary, a last line of defense rather than an opening move. I held the envelope in my hands, feeling its weight, understanding for the first time the true scale of what my grandfather had done to protect me. Sitting in that quiet office, I finally understood that this had stopped being a story about money the moment my father threatened to have his own father declared incompetent. This was about a dying man's dignity, about the last months of his life spent defending himself against people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. My grandfather hadn't built this elaborate legal protection because he doubted my ability to handle wealth. He built it because he'd watched firsthand exactly what his other children were capable of when money was on the table. I thanked Robert and asked him to keep everything secure until it was needed. He agreed, then added something that stayed with me the rest of the day. He said my grandfather had once told him that of all his grandchildren, I was the only one who had never once asked him for anything, not money, not favors, not even attention. He said that was exactly why he trusted me with everything. Driving home that evening, I found myself gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, replaying my grandfather's voice in my head, the exhaustion in his eyes as he described being cornered by his own son. I thought about every dinner where my father had performed grief with practiced precision, every moment my mother had squeezed my arm with false tenderness, every joke my brother made about soldiers and money. None of it had been about fairness. It had never been about fairness. It was about greed wearing the mask of family loyalty, and I was done letting them wear it in front of me. Whatever came next, I would face it not just as Carolyn protecting her inheritance, but as the one person left standing between my grandfather's memory and the people trying to erase what he actually stood for. The summons came 3 days later, this time with no pretense of warmth. My father called himself, his voice clipped and formal, informing me that the entire family would be gathering Sunday afternoon to finally settle this matter. He didn't ask if I was available. He told me to be there. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long moment, feeling something settle into place inside me, steady and resolved. Like a soldier checking equipment before a mission she already knew the outcome of. I spent those 3 days preparing, not with anger, but with the same methodical discipline I'd apply to any operation. I met with Robert twice, more organized copies of every document, confirmed exactly what evidence he would bring, and rehearsed in my mind how I would remain calm no matter what accusations were thrown at me. My grandfather had given me the ammunition. All I had to do was hold my position and let them walk into it themselves. Sunday arrived, gray and overcast, fitting weather for what was coming. I arrived at my parents' house to find the driveway full of cars, aunts and uncles and cousins I hadn't seen since the funeral, all gathered in the living room like a jury assembled for a trial I hadn't agreed to. My father stood at the front of the room near the fireplace, a position of authority he'd clearly chosen deliberately. My mother sat rigid on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. My brother leaned against the wall near the window, arms crossed, wearing the same expression he'd worn since childhood, whenever he thought he already knew he'd won. My father began speaking before I'd even fully sat down, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed this speech in a mirror. He told the assembled family that I had been given every opportunity to do the right thing, to share the inheritance fairly among everyone who had actually been present for Grandpa throughout his life, and that instead I had chosen selfishness, hiding behind legal technicalities, while the rest of the family grieved. Several relatives murmured in agreement, nodding along like they'd already been briefed on the narrative before walking through the door. My brother straightened off the wall and added that if I wasn't willing to negotiate reasonably, the family had no choice but to pursue this legally, to challenge the validity of the trust in court, where a judge could decide what was actually fair. He said it with a confidence that told me he believed there was no version of this where they didn't win. I let them finish. I let every accusation land in the room and settle into the silence before I spoke. Then I reached into my bag and set a folder on the coffee table, sliding it toward my father without a word. Inside was a full copy of the trust's anti-coercion clause, the language explicitly protecting my position as trustee against exactly this kind of pressure. I watched his eyes move across the page, watched the color shift slightly in his face as he realized this wasn't a fight he could win through intimidation alone. My mother's voice cut through the tension, brittle and defensive, insisting that none of this was about pressure, that they simply wanted what was best for the family as a whole. I looked at her steadily and told her I had heard otherwise directly in their own voices the night after the funeral. The room went quiet in a different way now, uncertain, the confidence that had filled it moments earlier beginning to crack at the edges. I reached into my bag a second time and placed my phone on the coffee table, my grandfather's recorded voice ready to play. I told them evenly that Grandpa had left something for exactly this moment. I pressed play. His voice filled the room, tired but resolute, describing the pressure he'd endured, the threats disguised as concern, the repeated attempts to rewrite his final wishes against his will. And then came the line that seemed to physically strike the room into silence. He said that if his family was hearing this recording, it meant they had already done exactly what he feared, that they had chosen greed over the people who actually loved him. I watched my father's face drain of color as his own father's voice condemned him, in front of every relative in the room. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. My brother's jaw tightened, his earlier confidence collapsing into something closer to panic. The aunts and uncles who had nodded along minutes earlier now exchanged uneasy glances, no longer certain which version of this story to believe. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute after the recording ended. I let the silence stretch, unwilling to fill it with anything that might soften what had just been revealed. Finally, an uncle I barely knew stood up, muttered something about needing air, and left the room entirely. Other relatives began shifting uncomfortably, some rising to leave the unified front my father had built, dissolving in real time before his own eyes. My father finally spoke again, his voice noticeably less certain than it had been minutes earlier, insisting that recording didn't tell the whole story, that Grandpa had been confused, manipulated by outside influences. I told him calmly that Robert had additional documentation, additional recordings, and that continuing down this path in court would only mean more of this becoming public record. I watched the calculation shift behind his eyes, the realization setting in that every angry word spoken in that room was now being weighed against a dead man's own testimony. I stood, gathered my folder and my phone, and told them I was done discussing this in a living room surrounded by an audience. If they wanted to pursue legal action, Robert would be ready. I walked out into the gray afternoon air, leaving behind a room full of people forced for the first time to see my family exactly as they truly were. They filed anyway. I wasn't surprised. Pride has a way of outlasting good judgment, and my father had built his entire identity around being the man who always won. 2 weeks after the recording played in that living room, Robert called to tell me my parents and brother had formally filed a challenge against the trust, requesting mediation before the case would proceed to court. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling strangely calm. Some part of me had known this was coming since the moment I heard their voices through that study door. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a conference room downtown, the kind of sterile, neutral space designed to strip emotion out of decisions that were entirely made of emotion. I arrived early with Robert, both of us dressed in the quiet, deliberate formality of people who intended to be taken seriously. My family arrived shortly after my father in his best suit, my mother's makeup unable to fully hide the tension around her eyes, my brother trailing slightly behind them with the posture of a man who no longer felt as certain as he once had. Their attorney opened first, a sharp, well-dressed man who argued that my grandfather had been elderly, isolated, and susceptible to influence in his final years, suggesting the trust itself might not reflect his true, uncoerced wishes. He spoke smoothly, confidently, painting a picture of a confused old man manipulated into cutting his own children out of what was rightfully theirs. For a moment, listening to him, I understood exactly how convincing this story could sound to someone who hadn't stood outside that door and heard the truth themselves. Then Robert stood and the room shifted. He laid out the anti-coercion clause, first explaining in precise legal terms exactly what protections my grandfather had built into the trust and why. Then he introduced the recordings one by one, each time-stamped and notarized, showing a clear pattern spanning nearly 2 years. My grandfather calmly describing repeated pressure to alter his will. My father's voice captured in one recording I hadn't even heard yet, explicitly suggesting a psychiatric evaluation to challenge his own father's competency if he continued refusing to cooperate. My brother's voice in another casually discussing how easy it would be to convince a judge that a career soldier lacked the sophistication to manage significant wealth. I watched my father's attorney's confidence falter with each recording, watched him glance sideways at his clients as the evidence mounted higher than anything he'd apparently been prepared for. Robert followed the recordings with printed transcripts, then with my grandfather's private journal entries, 3 years of handwritten pages documenting dates, conversations, specific threats cross-referenced meticulously with each recorded conversation. My grandfather hadn't just protected himself. He'd built an airtight case patiently, methodically, exactly the way I'd been trained to build one myself. The mediator, a woman with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression, reviewed each piece of evidence in silence, occasionally making notes, occasionally glancing up at my family with an expression that had shifted noticeably since the meeting began. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured but unmistakably firm. She stated that the evidence presented showed a clear, sustained pattern of psychological pressure and coercion directed at the deceased, and that nothing in the documentation suggested I had engaged in any wrongdoing whatsoever. If anything, she noted, the record showed I had actively avoided conflict at every opportunity, choosing patience and legal process over confrontation even when directly provoked. My mother's composure finally cracked. She reached for my father's arm, her voice thin and pleading, insisting this had all been a misunderstanding, that they only wanted what was fair. The mediator's expression didn't soften. She reminded the room plainly that fairness had already been determined by my grandfather himself in a legal document built specifically to withstand exactly this kind of challenge, and that continuing to pursue litigation would only expose my family to further scrutiny and potential legal consequences for the attempted coercion itself. I sat quietly through all of it, hands folded on the table, watching decades of quiet family dysfunction get laid bare under fluorescent lighting in front of strangers. There was no satisfaction in it, not really. Just a kind of exhausted clarity, the same feeling I imagined soldiers felt when a long grinding operation finally reached its conclusion. My father sat frozen, staring at the table, the architect of so many family gatherings, suddenly unable to find a single word to say. The mediation ended with my family formally withdrawing their legal challenge, the threat of continued exposure clearly outweighing whatever chance they believed they still had. As we filed out of that conference room, no one spoke. My brother wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother's face had aged years in a single morning. My father walked ahead of everyone alone, his posture stiff with a defeat he clearly hadn't prepared himself to accept. Word travels fast in small, tightly connected communities, and it wasn't long before whispers began circulating about what had happened in that mediation room. My father's standing at his company, built over decades on a reputation for integrity, began quietly eroding as details leaked out through mutual acquaintances. My brother's own business contacts grew noticeably distant. I never leaked a single detail myself. I didn't need to. The truth, once it was finally allowed into the light, did all the damage on its own. Driving home that evening, I rolled down my window and let the cool evening air fill the car, feeling something in my chest finally loosen after weeks of holding my breath. My grandfather had given me more than money. He'd given me the tools to protect not just his legacy but my own integrity, and I hadn't needed to raise my voice once to do it. 6 months have passed since that mediation room, and I finally feel like I can breathe without bracing for the next blow. I officially took over management of the trust in early spring, sitting across from Robert in his familiar office, signing the last of the paperwork with a steadiness in my hands that surprised even me. There was no celebration afterward, no champagne, nothing dramatic, just a quiet drive home and a long walk through my grandfather's old property, the one piece of this inheritance that had never felt like money to me at all. I didn't buy a bigger house. I didn't trade in my truck for something flashier or quit the reserve work I still do to stay connected to the discipline that shaped me. Instead, I sat down with Robert and a small team of advisors he trusted, and we began building something my grandfather would have recognized immediately, because it was built entirely out of the values he'd spent his life quietly living by. A significant portion of the trust now funds scholarships for children of active duty service members, kids who move every 2 years and rarely get the stability to plan for college the way other families can. Another piece supports Gold Star families, directly covering costs that no amount of gratitude from strangers ever quite manages to offset. The rest goes toward a Veterans Outreach Fund, providing housing assistance and mental health resources for men and women who came home from deployments carrying weight no one else could see. I remember signing the first round of distribution paperwork and feeling my grandfather's presence so strongly in that room that I had to pause for a moment before continuing. His house, the one with the porch where he taught me to identify birds by their calls, still stands exactly as it did the day he died. I couldn't bring myself to sell it, and I didn't want it to sit empty either. So, every year now, I open it up for a weekend gathering of local veterans, men and women my grandfather quietly helped over the decades, in ways I'm still discovering through old letters and records tucked into his files. Folding tables fill the backyard. Someone always brings a guitar. It's become the kind of gathering he would have loved, full of people who never asked him for anything and received his loyalty anyway. My relationship with my parents and brother settled into something civil but distant, the kind of politeness reserved for people who share history but no longer share trust. My mother reached out a handful of times over those months, her messages carefully worded, always circling toward reconciliation, without ever quite reaching an apology. My father sent one letter, formal and stiff, expressing regret about how things unfolded rather than what he'd actually done. My brother hasn't reached out at all. I don't carry anger about any of it anymore. I simply learned the hard way exactly how much weight their approval was ever worth, and I stopped waiting for it. Last week I drove out to the cemetery alone the way I do most months now. The grass around my grandfather's headstone had grown soft and green with early summer, and I sat beside it for a long while before I finally spoke. I told him about the scholarship recipients, about the first family who used the Gold Star Fund to keep their home after losing a son overseas, about the veterans who now treat his old porch like sacred ground every autumn. I told him I understood finally and completely why he built what he built the way he built it. I placed my hand flat against the cool stone and said the words I'd been carrying for months, the ones that finally felt true instead of just hopeful. I told him he'd been right. I didn't need to prove I deserved this money. I only needed to live in a way that honored the faith he'd placed in me, quietly, patiently, without ever needing to hear a thank you for it. I stood up, eventually brushed the grass from my uniform pants, and walked back to my car under a sky that had cleared into something soft and golden. Behind me, my family continues living with the consequences of choices they made in a moment of greed they never expected to be witnessed. Ahead of me, there's a life my grandfather spent decades quietly building toward, and I intend to spend the rest of mine making sure it means something. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know what you think happens next for Caroline, and I want to hear where in the world you're watching from tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know. Stories like this one remind me that the people who love us quietly are often the ones protecting us the most, and I have so many more stories like this to share with you. Subscribe so you never miss one, and let's keep walking through these journeys together.